Hello.
Hello.
I'm Hilary.
I'm Indigo.
And you're listening to The Full Blossom of the Evening, a podcast about David Lynch and Twin Peaks.
Listeners, we're going to tell it to you, and we're going to tell it to you straight. Today, we're talking about In Cold Blood.
It was Laura. And I saw her glowing. I saw her smiling. I feel like I'm gonna dream tonight.
So before we begin our topic today, we want to thank Colin James again for having us on Creamed Corn in the Universe.
It was so much fun, and Colin was so kind and welcoming. It was so great.
Yes, and if you haven't listened to the episode where we were guests on that show talking about Harriet Hayward, please go listen.
Yeah, it is so enjoyable. It is so fun. I feel like we had really good banter, and if you're listening to this podcast, you obviously love Twin Peaks, so you'll enjoy that episode as well.
You will enjoy all of Colin's episodes.
Yes, very true. Very true.
But thank you again. And thank you to all of the people who have reached out to us with messages, tweets, messages on Instagram, direct messages. It's been so fun hearing your feedback, and we just appreciate each and every comment and message so much.
Yeah, we were just talking about, before we started recording this episode, about how it has been mind-blowing, honestly, seeing the response from all of you. Again, whether it's been messages or comments, or even just looking at the numbers of how many of you are listening to this, it feels bizarre almost, but in a great way. It's just, I don't think we imagined it would take off so quickly, and we're so grateful that it has.
Yes, we thought maybe in a year.
Yeah, maybe someday somebody will look back and be like, oh, that was a really cute little podcast or something. But no, you guys have really just taken with it and just been so supportive. It's been so exciting, and it's made continuing forward with this and recording new episodes even more exciting.
Yes. And if we are starting out another episode with effusive thanks and praise to our listeners, it's because we're very new at this. And so
yes, we're just very overwhelmed that everyone is actually being so nice and supportive.
Yes. And being newbies to podcasting.
Yes.
We're so emotional.
We are. We're also just, we have a lot of feelings.
So thank you for entertaining our few moments of feelings.
Thank you. All right, listeners. So again, today we are talking about In Cold Blood. And so this episode's topic is what we're calling an uncanny resonance. In our introductory episode, we did talk about the different categories of topics that we are planning on addressing in this podcast. Our Lolita episode was what we call a tangible resonance. Lynch has publicly spoken and written about his love for that film, and we explored some of the connections between Lolita and Lynch's work. But uncanny resonance is the name that we've given to echoes from texts or works that don't have a documented basis that we're aware of, but that have deeply interesting connections nonetheless.
Right. And our objective here is truly not just to wildly speculate. And we are not trying to convince you that Lynch was secretly inspired by, in this case, Truman Capote. Mm-hmm. We're not trying to make an argument here. Right? As we said again in our introductory episode, no artist or artistic work exists in a vacuum, and artists are always in conversation, in a sense, with the culture as a whole. And Indigo and I are both really fascinated by how Lynch's work reflects and contributes to that conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but we're going to start with some background on the book In Cold Blood.
Yeah, for anyone who's not familiar, especially we've noticed that we have some listeners that are outside of the United States.
A full 25% of our listeners.
Which is so wild.
Yes.
But so it's very possible that you may not be familiar with this. It is older. This was in 1959. And this was a true crime that rocked America. It unsettled people. It made them feel unsafe in their homes. It took small town America and made it a frightening place to be, which before that, it was the safest place you could think of.
Yes, the Clutter family murders, as Indigo said, were in 1959. And although they were in a very small, unincorporated town of, 500 some people?
Yeah, so small.
In Holcomb, Kansas, it was national news. It was covered by publications like Time Magazine, the New York Times, and a novelist, screenwriter, journalist named Truman Capote traveled to Holcomb with his friend Harper Lee, who you may know from To Kill a Mockingbird.
I should hope so.
Yes. He went there to write an article for The New Yorker. He was there to write about the murders and the investigation, the hunt for the murderers. He ended up spending years on the story. He took over 8,000 pages of notes from his research, and he conducted hundreds of interviews.
And that final product was In Cold Blood, a beautiful example of what was called new journalism, or by Capote himself, a nonfiction novel. And this is one of the first examples of true crime in literature in that format, in that way.
Yes. Capote didn't create true crime.
Yeah,
right?
no.
But he did elevate it to the level of serious literature.
Yeah, this was huge at the time. Capote used his skills as a literary artist to tell the stories of the Clutter family, the men who murdered them, and the investigation, trial, and executions that followed. He covered it from the start to the finish.
He did, yeah. The Clutter murders had been national news, but In Cold Blood made the story of what happened to this family an indelible part of American lore. It was first serialized in The New Yorker in 1965, and then it was published as a book in 1966. It was an instant runaway bestseller. It became what the 2017 documentary Cold-Blooded called, quote, the most discussed book in America. And Truman Capote became the most famous writer in America and maybe the world.
Yeah, and the fame of the book has endured. It's the second best-selling true crime book of all time, and most Americans don't finish high school or college without it being assigned to them. And I can speak to that. The first time I read it was in high school. It was just part of the assigned canon, pretty much.
So if you haven't read it, you should. Please go read it. Even if you don't love true crime, you will love In Cold Blood.
Yeah.
Or see the film.
Yeah, you have options. If you're not a reader, there are other options.
There's a 1967 film by Richard Brooks. Mm-hmm. It was filmed on location in the Clutter house. It was filmed in the courtroom where the trial was held, and even featured 7 of the actual jurors in the jury box of the film. Incredible realism.
And that's one of those things that you don't always see either.
Almost never.
Yeah, especially like in like a film version, not necessarily a documentary of it, because that was, again, this was a film. They went to the actual locations. That's pretty huge.
But In Cold Blood is a permanent part of American literature and American culture. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think that it's really, again, because it's, so there's films, there are documentaries, there's so much that has come out of this book alone, and also just the story itself. Because again, it scared so much of America. It changed the way that they looked at their neighbors, the way that they looked at their communities. Before that, a lot of people would just go to bed without locking their doors.
Yeah.
They just trusted people. And not to say that this was a crime that was necessarily done by neighbors. This was 2 outsiders. But it really shocked and scared people.
Yeah. And Lynch and Frost haven't publicly stated that Twin Peaks was in any way inspired by In Cold Blood. But when we consider In Cold Blood's incredible fame and influence, it's like Twin Peaks would have had to deliberately avoid its influence if it wanted to, right? It would have had to make a conscious effort not to be influenced by this story.
Yeah, because I mean, it was everywhere. It was, you couldn't avoid hearing about it at that time. This would have been what everyone was talking about, especially in small town America. In the like safe cul-de-sacs where David Lynch was growing up, those were the communities that were just absolutely horrified when they heard about this, because that's them.
Absolutely. And just to say, we do know, I'm currently reading the book Murder at Teal's Pond, right? So we know there is a true crime story out there, the murder of Hazel Drew, that Mark Frost has said was like his first ghost story that he remembers hearing about, and that in some way inspired Twin Peaks. So we know that story's out there. There are a lot of differences between that true crime story and Twin Peaks. And so that story's been told. It's a wonderful book. Please go read it. But today we're focusing on this true crime story in particular.
Yeah, because that one has been talked about, and most people talk a lot about the similarities, like physically, between the two, between Hazel and Laura. But here we're looking at a lot about personality between particularly Laura and the daughter of the family, Nancy Clutter. But even beyond that, the whole family, the whole situation, there are a lot of really spooky coincidences.
So if we have a thesis for this episode, it's probably this, that the echoes we see between Twin Peaks and In Cold Blood touch on significant aspects of the ways Americans process the seeming ubiquity of random violence, its perpetrators, and its victims. In the past episodes, we've had almost chapters or specific topics that we discuss and try to keep it organized that way. We've found, though, planning for this episode, that it's a little more fluid.
Yeah.
So we're going to introduce our main points here at the beginning with the understanding that, like, we have a plan.
Yes.
But they are. but these topics will overlap and kind of bleed into each other throughout the discussion.
Yeah, it's just because it's not a book, it's an event.
Yeah.
There's so much that just overlaps and bleeds into one another. There's so many connections that are going to be made that breaking it down into just like a numbered, like bullet pointed list just doesn't suit it for this one.
Okay, so here are some of the main points that we're going to address separately, but they will overlap quite a bit too.
Yeah.
First, as Indigo mentioned, the parallels between the characterizations of Laura Palmer and Nancy Clutter.
Also, the similarities between the impacts of their deaths and their closest friends. And like, for example, how we see in the show the way that it affects Laura's peers.
We'll talk about the similarities between the town of Twin Peaks and Holcomb, Kansas, and how the murders impact life in those towns.
We're also going to talk about the similarities between the portrayals of the murderers in both.
And finally, and probably throughout, we're going to discuss the realities of 20th century American culture that both In Cold Blood and Twin Peaks reflect. From our earliest days of discussing this podcast, Indigo, this was one of the very first topics you brought up as a possible episode, In Cold Blood.
Yeah, I am obsessed with this book, and even though there's a lot of bizarre and semi-controversial lore about it now, I was immediately drawn to it when I first read it in high school. At that point, I had not seen Twin Peaks yet, but I remember watching Twin Peaks and seeing the similarities, and then upon rereading, because I do like to reread it, I do enjoy it, I was just kind of struck dumb by some of the similarities that I saw. Because, I mean, of course, you know, we're in this small town America. There's this murder that shocks everybody, but it goes so much deeper than that because Nancy is so much like Laura, to a bizarre amount almost. So the biggest thing that really stuck out to me was that they are both, they're sort of seen as like a character. I mean, obviously Laura is a character. Nancy's a real person, but they're both seen as these characters sort of by the people in their lives of the girl who does it all. She's beautiful, she's popular, you know, everyone knows who she is, everyone wants to be her, everyone wants to date her, and she does all these things, you know, like with Laura, she does like the Meals on Wheels, you know, she's got her job, she's this town sweetheart. And Nancy was described as the town darling. She's described very much in the way that people describe Laura throughout the show, you know, so bright and friendly and beautiful, always doing a lot in her community. Nancy was 16 at the time. Laura was 17 at the time of the murders. And we really get this sense that everyone that met Nancy just loved her. And that's what we always hear about with Laura. And that's what we see in the show. All of her interactions with people when we see any flashbacks or the ways that they talk about her and, you know, after her passing, people loved Laura. She was so lovable because she was able to be sort of a chameleon too for people and be what they needed her to be. And you get that impression with Nancy. And like, for sure, there's a part of it that it's like, okay, is this just the teenage girl experience? But I think it just goes a little bit further than that too.
Right. That was not my teenage girl experience.
Yeah, maybe not everybody.
No, but I Indigo, when I reread this book after you mentioned its connections to Twin Peaks, and I read with Twin Peaks in mind, I mean, I've got hundreds of little book flags here in this edition.
She does. I'm looking at it right now.
But I wrote in the margin notes here on page 18 when it's describing Nancy's activities in the town and what it is, I've written here in pencil, she is everything to everyone.
Yeah.
Nancy is everything to everyone.
Yeah. There's a quote here that I pulled, which is, where she found the time and still managed to practically run that big house and be a straight-A student, the president of her class, a leader in the 4-H program and the Young Methodist League, a skilled rider, an excellent musician, piano, clarinet, an annual winner at the county fair, pastry, preserves, needlework, flower arrangement. How a girl not yet 17 could haul such a wagon load and do so without brag, with rather merely a radiant jauntiness, was an enigma to the community. The community pondered and solved by saying, she's got character, gets it from her old man.
Yeah, and her old man would be Herb Clutter,
yes,
who also is a victim of the Clutter murders.
Yes. I mean, so when we hear that, we think about the way that Laura was always stretching herself thin. Also, in case you missed that, it said that she was a skilled rider. Just like Laura, she loved riding horses. Mm-hmm. We see in The Secret Diary so many times she talks about her horse Troy and how much she loved him and how that was such a special escape for her. And it was the same way for Nancy. Horseback riding was like a beautiful escape for her. It was something she really loved to do.
And her horse was named Babe.
Yeah. Which is also such a great horse name.
I also think it's a very fun note that that Nancy is a champion cherry pie maker.
Yes. Yeah. And there's even like a scene where we see her making time out of her day to help another person in the town, another young girl, prepare and like learn how to make, you know, Nancy Clutter's pie. You know, she always made time for everyone. And again, we see that all the time with Laura. Where Laura found the time, who knows? The energy, we do know, lots of cocaine.
Yes, lots of trauma.
Yes, that too. Yeah. Nancy, I think she had some spirit.
The book doesn't give us any sense of Nancy's deeper life.
No,
right?
No. Nothing darker quite in the way that we get with Laura, but we just see that, you know, kind of surface level. And also we get the impression that she really pushed herself to impress her father.
Yes.
To be the perfect daughter. Always trying to be the perfect daughter. And that was one of the things that I had seen while I was like sort of going through materials, that someone had described her as, well, saying that because she died young and she died at sort of this prime in her life, she died the dutiful daughter. And it's sort of like the same thing with Laura, where as far as we know, outside of her inner circle, outside of the people that really dive into her death, probably the rest of the town still thinks of Laura as this like perfect homecoming queen, this image that they have of her. They don't necessarily know about that darker side. So in their minds, she would just be the way that everyone sees Nancy Clutter.
Oh, and I think that's so important, that it's so easy for us as viewers to say, oh, well, Laura is so complicated, she's so full of secrets and so forth. We're privy to all of that.
Yeah.
We are. Cooper is.
Yeah. Her friends are once they
Donna,
really delve into it.
Sure, Bobby. But you're right. For the majority of the town, the people showing up at her funeral, she is the smiling homecoming queen.
Yeah, and that's how they're always going to remember her.
That's how she's remembered. That's how she's crystallized.
Yes.
In the memory of the town, as this vision of perfection. And so that secret part of Laura Palmer that's so vivid to us as viewers is not the reality that most of the town knows her to be.
And also, one of the biggest things that I think we both kind of screamed about when you got to that part was the fact that there is even a point where Nancy says that nighttime was her time.
Nighttime is my time.
Yeah, because she's describing that nighttime was her time to be selfish. Mm-hmm. It's that, and also we say selfish, but it's like, oh, Nancy, no, you should have time to yourself.
I know. I have it, actually.
Yes, please.
It says, the midnight hours were her, quote, time to be selfish and, quote, vain.
Yeah.
It was then that she went through her beauty routine, a cleansing, creaming ritual, which on Saturday nights, including washing her hair.
Like, that's just...
How selfish.
Like, God forbid she have a moment to herself after pushing herself all day for everyone else around her. But she would become a night owl. She would stay up late so that she could find the time to still have just a smidge for herself left over at the end of the day.
Yeah. And she'd also write in her diary.
Yes, which was another thing that really stood out to me. I mean, of course, okay, it's not uncommon for teenage girls to have diaries, but her diary is important.
It becomes part of the murder investigation.
Just in the same way that Laura's does.
And that diary leads to her boyfriend being the prime suspect at first.
Her boyfriend, who is also named Bobby. Like, come on. For anyone, if anyone is at this point in the podcast and you're still having doubts, if you're still like, I don't know, maybe these girls are just making it up, I don't know. At this point, I think you have to be with us.
Again, we're not trying to make an argument that this is definitively true, but it is really funny. That's why we call it an uncanny resonance.
Yes. You have to see the coincidence.
It is uncanny. It is.
Yeah. So the other thing with Bobby, with Nancy's Bobby, is that he's honestly more like kind of a mix between Bobby and James
in Twin Peaks.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he's not exactly like the Bobby we know. Yeah. So Bobby Rupp, Nancy's boyfriend, also after her murder, they sort of bond through grief, him and Nancy's best friend, Susan Kidwell, who is kind of our Donna here. Mm-hmm. And if we think about the way that James and Donna come together after the murder, it sounds a lot like it does with Bobby and Susan in the book. They just sort of bond through that grief together, and it's really heartbreaking. You know, they're trying to work through something really tragic that has happened to them. And thankfully, as far as we know, they don't sing any weird songs in a living room about it, but it does definitely bring them together. And, you know, that's something that we absolutely see in Twin Peaks.
Susan Kidwell in Cold Blood says, I couldn't go to school, not for those first few days. I stayed out of school until after the funeral. So did Bobby Rupp. For a while, Bobby and I were always together. Later in the book, it says of Susan and Bobby that grief had drawn a circle around him he could not escape from, and others could not enter, except possibly Sue. Until Nancy's death, he had not appreciated Sue, never felt altogether comfortable with her. And thereafter Nancy's death, he and Sue, her best friend Susan, become very, very close. But they struggle after a while of their friendship. Their friendship wanes after about a month, and it says the trouble was that they were forcing each other to mourn and remember what, in fact, they wanted to forget.
Yeah, I mean, like, that could literally be a quote about James and Donna if you just change the names. Yeah, so that's, again, just like another connection between the two. Beyond Nancy, just like the family in general, the mother, Bonnie, we see some similarities between her and Sarah, too.
And just to be fair to the real-life Bonnie Clutter, this is one of the objections that the surviving members of the Clutter family have had to In Cold Blood, was the characterization of Bonnie Clutter in this book as being a depressed person, a kind of isolated, checked-out person. They, in fact, say that the real Bonnie Clutter was not like this. So we're discussing her as a character, in a sense.
Yeah, at this point, we're talking about her as the book character. Because in the book, she's described as being very withdrawn, very checked out, very depressed, and really struggling. You know, probably, you know, nowadays looking at it, maybe this was like a postpartum type of situation.
Sure.
You know, back then there just really weren't good resources or help for that. So instead it was just sort of like, all right, I guess you're going to stay in your bedroom all day and we're going to just pretend you're not. I don't know. But so when we think about how removed Sarah is at times, she can be, you know, we see her like willingly kind of tuning herself out a lot to just sort of get through everything that's going on in that dark household, the Palmer household.
Right.
Meanwhile, complete opposite, the way that we see Herb Clutter, the father of the family in the household, described is, you know, the way that the town at least sees Leland, and that, you know, he was like a huge figure in the town. He was well respected. He was, you know, had a good deal of power, I would say, in the town. I want to clarify for sure that we don't get any impression that he was abusive or possessed or anything in the way that Leland is, to be very, very clear. But that, at least that outward view of him being this figure in the town, that really resonates with the way that we see Laura and Leland, because that's the big thing, is that with this murder, the main focus was on him and Nancy
In the story.
Yeah. And it was really in Cold Blood, Bonnie and the son and brother of Nancy, Kenyon, got really swept under the rug. We don't get a lot about Kenyon. What we do get is that it sounds like maybe he was like on the spectrum or something, or just a little awkward or shy and just didn't really fit in. And for the same reasons that Capote sweeps Bonnie under the rug for being potentially depressed or quiet, which again, we don't even know if that's necessarily true. This is maybe just all theatrical on Capote's part. But we need to talk about, why do we only talk about dead girls? We don't talk about Kenyon. We don't talk about boys that get murdered, which is just equally as horrifying. But the world is fascinated by young girls who get murdered.
Yes, and I have a book in hand called Dead Girls. Essays on Surviving an American Obsession. This is by Alice Bolin, and it does talk a lot about Twin Peaks. I want to say that I don't 100% agree with Bolin's arguments with her thesis here, but she did make some pretty interesting observations and comments that I think make a nice departure for our discussion. So she, in Dead Girls, in one of the essays that's called Toward a Theory of a Dead Girls Show. And Bolin believes that Twin Peaks is the first of which she considers a glut of Dead Girls shows. I disagree with her. But anyway, she very interestingly here is talking about Maggie Nelson, the author of a book called The Red Parts. And she's quoting Maggie Nelson here, where she says a character asks another character, quote, "If there's a reason why stories about the bizarre, violent deaths of young, good-looking, middle to upper-class white girls help people to mourn better than other stories." Bolin goes on to say then, clearly, dead girls help us work out our complicated feelings about the privileged status of white women in our culture. The paradox of the perfect victim, effacing the deaths of leagues of non-white or poor or ugly or disabled or immigrant or drug-addicted or gay or trans victims, encapsulates the combination of the worshipful covetousness and violent rage that drives the dead girl's show. The white girl becomes the highest sacrifice, the virgin martyr, particularly to that most unholy idol of narrative.
Oof. Think about it, folks. When you are perusing the news, when you see articles about missing girls, about dead girls, think about how often do you see that about boys? Unless maybe they're like toddlers. I feel like I only see it when they're like toddlers. But the teenage boys that are brutally slain, you don't see it in the way that you see the nation come together to find the killer of a young, pretty white girl. Specifically, I like that quote because it really comments on that. Because again, if there's any sense of marginalization to that person, if they are a woman of color, if they are queer, if they are trans,
if they're poor,
it gets brushed under the rug. But people come together. I mean, think about Gone Girl in the way that they're like, no, not pretty white girl that we've written these cute books about, not the pretty white girl. And Nancy became that. And she didn't ask for that. I'm sure that she would have been horrified to have read that and seen her brother swept under the rug. I'm sure siblings have spats and everything, but I think that this goes far beyond that. And so it's really heartbreaking in the way that he and Bonnie are really just kind of stuffed away in the book. When we think about the ways that Nancy and Herb were brought to the front, just because they were these shining examples in the town, because they were more popular or well-liked, according to Capote. Again, that doesn't even necessarily mean that that was true, that there weren't people that loved Bonnie and Kenyon the same way that they loved Nancy and Herb.
Oh, and they absolutely did. Again, in the documentary Cold Blooded, they interview a childhood friend of Kenyon's who talks about how funny he was.
Yeah.
And you get no sense of that personality in Cold Blood. So we know that Kenyon and Bonnie were real people.
Yeah. If anything, it speaks to, again, there's a lot of controversial stuff about this book and how Capote wrote it, because there's definitely some favoritism.
Yeah. Popularity bias.
Yes,
yeah.
It's fictionalized for sure in some senses.
Yeah. And I like that connection to what Bolin says here about the white girl becoming the highest sacrifice, the virgin martyr. Throughout In Cold Blood, the loss of Nancy, who's called that wonderful girl, that the loss of Nancy to this town seems, at least in Capote's characterization, to be the deepest wound. The loss of Herb Clutter is bad, but there's something about this person who is at the beginning of her life and who has so much potential. She's portrayed as if the town has invested in her all of its hopes and dreams, all of its visions for a glorious future. And then she is so cruelly cut down and senselessly cut down in the most violent way.
Yeah, and it's so sad because we never get to see her future. We don't get to see what she could have been in the same way that we don't with Laura. We don't get to know what Laura could have gone on to do if she had gotten out of Twin Peaks. We'll never know what Nancy would have been capable of. But the society, the community loves to speculate that she would have been this shining beacon for them. And we don't even necessarily know if that's true, but she is stuck on this pedestal forever.
As is Laura, right?
Yeah.
Laura is forever the smiling face in the trophy case.
Yeah.
There in her homecoming portrait.
Yeah.
So we're going to transition now to talking about the crime itself a little bit. And there's a quote in Cold Blood that encapsulates something here quite well. It says, "Of all the people in the world, the Clutters were the least likely to be murdered."
Yeah, they were kind of the poster family of the town. They were leaders in the community, and everyone admired them.
And Herb Clutter was renowned for his kindness, his generosity, his fairness with people. They were just very well loved, and they deserved that love because of their personal characteristics. Also, Holcomb, Kansas is an incredibly safe little town in the middle of nowhere where people were not afraid. And we will talk a lot about the impact on the town. But it was because of Herb Clutter's kindness, ironically and unfortunately, that they ended up being targeted by these murderers named Dick Hickok and Perry Smith. And a lot of In Cold Blood is the story of these two men and the murders they carried out.
Yeah. This was all happening in real time as Capote was following the case, as they were finding the killers, bringing them to justice. He was kind of front and center reporting on this.
Right. And the reason we said that it's Herb Clutter's kindness that leads the murderers to them is, I guess, 10 years before the murders, he had employed a field hand, a farmhand named Floyd Wells. And he treated Floyd Wells like he did all of his employees very, very well, gave him a generous Christmas bonus. And Floyd Wells later was incarcerated, and his roommate was Dick Hickok. Roommates in prison made small talk, and Floyd Wells talked about his employer who was wealthy and generous and lived in this small town, Holcomb, Kansas. And Dick Hickok started talking about how when he would get out of prison, he was going to go to Holcomb and murder and rob this family. But Floyd Wells didn't take him seriously. He said everybody in prison says things like this. And he didn't think it was real until he heard about the Clutters being murdered.
Yeah, and we get the very strong impression that he felt horrible.
He did. And so it was also Herb Clutter's kindness and decency that led to justice being served because Floyd Wells came forward.
Yeah.
And it was on the information that Floyd Wells brought forward to investigators that the investigators even learned Perry Smith and Dick Hickok's names and were able to eventually arrest them.
Yeah, because as we said before, like with Bobby and stuff, of course, originally they were looking at people in the town. They had no idea that it was outsiders that had come in and murdered them in cold blood.
And so completely random, right? Yeah. They've never met these people. They know nothing about them. They drove, what did we calculate? 380 miles?
Yeah.
They drive 380 miles to murder this family in the middle of the night.
No personal connection. It wasn't a crime of passion or anything. And that's part of the thing that really shook the country, I think, was that if these people can come from anywhere and just attack you out of the blue in the middle of the night, then is anyone safe?
Yeah.
It's a very scary thought.
Right. So much of the book is Perry and Dick's story, their backgrounds, the investigation, their confessions, and so on and so on. And it's in Perry Smith's confession that we learn about what it was like to meet Nancy as her murderer.
Yeah. We come to understand from him that he and Dick were very charmed by her. She did under pressure what she needed to do to try to survive this situation. I mean, so if we talk about the F responses like fight and flight and freeze and fawn, she fawned. So she attempted to try to communicate with them. She tried to, and we see this a lot with like victims of like kidnapping and things like that, where they'll talk about afterwards that how they got out was that they talked to their captors and they tried to humanize themselves and be like, please, look, I'm a person. I totally understand that you have probably had a really rough life or something. Let's be friends. Don't kill me. I'm a person. We could be friends.
Yeah. This is Perry Smith saying, I asked Nancy if she had a boyfriend. She said, yes, she did. She was trying hard to act casual and friendly. I really liked her. She was really nice. A very pretty girl and not spoiled or anything. She told me quite a lot about herself, about school and how she was going to a university to study music and art, horses. Said next to dancing, what she liked best was to gallop a horse, so I mentioned my mother had been a champion rodeo rider. And we talked about Dick. I was curious to see what he'd been saying to her. Seems she'd asked him why he did things like this, rob people. And wow, did he toss her a tearjerker. And he made up stories and lies to tell Nancy.
And we see then that like she's trying so hard to have these conversations with them. She knows that at this point there's no way that she can physically escape without being like released. And so what does she have? She has her pure heart. She has her charm. And again, like at this point, Nancy's used to being able to charm anyone in the town. She's the town darling. So she uses her words and her heart to try to sway these people to not kill her and her family.
Right.
Which is just horrifying. I mean, it's really a horrifying thought, a horrifying image to picture her in this terrifying situation. And she is trying so hard not to freak out or maybe like get too emotional in a way that might set them off or upset them.
Yeah.
She's not trying to scream or anything. She's just like, I'm going to go to college and study horses.
And I feel that so many of us who have been in very dangerous situations, who have resorted to fawn, feel this. I don't know. I react very viscerally to this.
Oh, yeah.
Because for Perry Smith to say that he liked Nancy, it just disgusts me. Because I know Nancy wasn't trying to make Perry like her. She was trying to survive.
She was frantically trying to survive.
And isn't it interesting that he misread that the obliviousness to the fawn response is pretty telling and stunning.
Right. And also, I know that when we had first talked, you had made a point about the way that he's like, and she wasn't spoiled or anything. Like, okay, so what if she hadn't fawned? If she had been like, let me go.
Yeah.
This is insane. You guys are crazy or something. If she had come across as combative or didn't agree with what you were doing, if she had come off as spoiled and not so humble and meek or something, you would have probably killed her faster. Is that what you're saying?
She would, yeah. The end result is the same for Nancy,
Right.
whether you like her or not. You psychopath.
Yeah.
So we should point out that there are quite a few differences between Perry Smith and Dick Hickok.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about the way these two characters are portrayed is I think there's quite a nice lineup with Bob and Leland.
Yeah.
Here
They're two
too.
sides of the same coin.
They are. They're two sides of the same murder.
Yeah.
Interestingly, sorry to keep referencing this documentary, but in Cold Blooded, two more contemporary members of the KBI said that there's no way either of them would have committed these murders alone. Hickok and Smith needed each other to do this, just as we could say Leland and Bob wouldn't have committed these crimes, wouldn't have killed Laura.
One has
and
the
Teresa.
arm and one raises it.
Right, exactly. And so it was the combination of the two.
Yeah.
Even the two sides here, even the two personalities of Perry Smith and Dick Hickok kind of line up.
Yeah. Dick is a lot more chaotic and kind of like animalistic, very driven by desires and rage, a lot more violent on the surface level.
He is.
Kind of.
He behaves quite psychopathically.
Yeah.
Even in Cold Blood, and in like the actual documentation from the trial as well, that he whistles and sings songs. He seems very unbothered. He has a huge appetite. He's always eating. He's very smiley and charming.
He has a history of assaulting women.
Young women, children.
Yes.
In fact, although this crime seems to be motivated by money, quite late in the book, Dick Hickok says in a written testimonial to his psychiatrist that was not his prime motivation. And the first time I read In Cold Blood, maybe the first 3 times I read it, this didn't stand out to me. This rereading, it was like screaming off the page at me, where he says, this is Dick Hickok's own words. I know it is wrong, but at the time I never give any thought to whether it is right or wrong. These are his acts of pedophilia. The same with stealing. It seems to be an impulse. One thing I never told you about the Clutter deal is this. Before I ever went to their house, I knew there would be a girl there. I think the main reason I went there was not to rob them, but to rape the girl. That is one reason I never wanted to turn back when we started to, even when I saw there was no safe. And he doesn't get that opportunity because Perry Smith stops him from raping Nancy before they murder her. But to think that that is his main motivation, to drive 380 miles.
Just because he loves raping children.
Yeah. And so Nancy's centrality to the story in some ways feels quite fitting then.
Yeah.
Because this isn't so much a story about a theft, an attempted robbery.
What they left with was about $50 and a radio. Mm-hmm. Not even like a super fancy one.
This was a murder motivated first and foremost by the desire to commit sexual violence against a young woman, a young girl.
Yeah, and this is what baffled the police and everyone who was investigating it at the very start of everything, because again, there was no like clear sign of like any intense robbery. Like it wasn't like, you know, they had taken much that was noticeable. So they thought this must be some kind of crime of passion. This must be personal. Mm-hmm. And then when they started moving through the motions of investigating and started to figure out that it was not someone in the town, once they found out about Dick and Perry, it was just like, why?
Yeah. What would the purpose of this be?
Empty-handed, practically mm-hmm. empty-handed. What would drive a person to do this?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. To just brutally and systematically murder 4 people. Yeah. And so if we look at Dick Hickok as very much the Bob figure in this duo, Perry Smith is the deeply damaged, traumatized child who grows up to have all kinds of issues and problems and then is driven by Hickok's plan, mm-hmm. Hickok's idea, you know, at all throughout the process. Perry's questioning it and mm-hmm. getting scared and wanting to back out. Yeah. But he's ultimately the one who pulls the trigger.
Yeah. In like interviews and things like that, it seems like he genuinely thinks that he has a good heart mm-hmm. and that, mm-hmm. you know, I mean, even when he's talking about Nancy, he's like, oh, she was nice. Mm-hmm. And it's like, you don't have the right to say a single word about her. He talks a lot about, you know, having a traumatic childhood, which, you know, that is horrible, but also his own sister is terrified of him, and rightfully so, obviously. So yeah, it's like, okay, so you had a really terrible childhood. That doesn't excuse you murdering an entire family.
No, and certainly in Twin Peaks, we get this idea that Leland was preyed on mm-hmm. as a child by Bob, right? He was just a little boy when Bob possessed him or whatever. Yeah, I can see on Indigo's face she doesn't want to go down this road.
Leland is never going to get a pass. Neither does Perry. It's not an excuse for the crimes that you perpetuate with that hate that has been filled up in you. And Perry, he tries to play it off a lot. I feel like that he's this, you know, hurt, misunderstood, traumatized person, that he's been through so much, and that the clutter seemed really nice, and he wished he hadn't had to do that. Okay, well, you didn't have to.
And he at first says that he kills 2 of them. He admits mm-hmm. to killing Herb Clutter and Kenyon, mm-hmm. and insists that Dick Hickok killed the women, Nancy and Bonnie. Later, he recants and says that he killed all 4, but he says it's to give some comfort to Dick Hickok's mother, you know, to I guess, let her believe that her son didn't commit the murder. So it's unclear whether he did or not pull the trigger 4 times on the family.
But, and also, if we want to talk about nature versus nurture, mm-hmm. I think just because you mentioned his mother, you know, it's like, okay, so Perry, he's like, well, I had a really, really rough go of it when I was growing up. Dick had a lovely family.
He really did.
They were really nice. They loved him very much, and he still turned out very evil.
Yeah. It's interesting how these 2 murderers are the picture of nature versus nurture.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's like it really doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you either have it in you to kill someone in cold blood or you don't. You are either the type of person that you walk into a house with, very little plan or motive, and you kill an entire family.
Right. So again, like the Bob and Leland, right? Yeah. Bob would be the nature, obviously, right, as a demonic entity of sorts, and Leland more the nurture, right, of shaped by experiences.
So, as we mentioned, this really shook up the community. This shook up the whole country. The Clutter murders brought fear to the town, and fear had not lived there before. No one locked their doors. Kids would just play freely all over the area, even girls, just by themselves, alone. Like, no one was worried. No one was afraid that someone was going to shoot them down in their own homes, and they thought that nothing bad would happen to them. This was small town America at a time when that meant something.
Yeah, the
that
1950s.
Meant an image.
Oh, for sure. And it wasn't just an image, it was a reality for a lot of Americans mid-century. And so we're talking now about the similarities we see between the real town of Holcomb, Kansas, portrayed in Cold Blood, and the town of Twin Peaks.
Yeah. Because, same thing. So Twin Peaks also, that's part of the charm of Twin Peaks. That's part of what draws people in when they're watching the show, is that it is this small town. It's so Americana. It's so retro. It's so cute. Everybody is such a character, because you get that feel with small towns where it's just like you've got, each person has a role in the town.
And that is so much this description of Holcomb, Kansas, right?
Yeah.
There's the diner.
Right? There's the post office. There's
the characters who work at or own these various establishments, and their big personalities and kind of what they're known for in the town.
Yeah, because also, Capote's going around interviewing these people, trying to get a feel for the Clutter family, and it really lets us see them. It lets us see how much everyone trusted each other. And when Laura dies, and it's a murder, it is something that shakes up Twin Peaks. They don't know what to do with this information. They don't know how to move forward with one of their own. And not only that, but they're like prize. They're like, most beloved girl in town.
Right.
That first initial scene when the news is being shared at the school and the reactions of the other students, like, Laura was loved. This was this deeply impacted every one of her peers for the rest of their lives. And we only get to see the inner circle. We don't really get to see how it affected her other peers. And the same is kind of said for the Clutters as well. It's like, we get like a brief view from Capote, and we get to see after the fact some of the ways that this has affected people that were close to the family.
Yeah, I know in the book it refers to the town having the unique experience of distrusting each other as they believe the murder was among themselves. And that always reminds me of the town hall meeting in the pilot of Twin Peaks, where Cooper says, like, the murderer might be among you now. He might be one of you. Right. What is it like to live in a small town like that, where your population sign ends with a 1? Right? Where each individual person has that kind of value. The meaning of that 1 with the loss of Laura Palmer is so strong. That 1 is gone now. But here they are all looking at each other like, well, who among us would have done this? Who do we not trust now? And certainly that happens in the town of Holcomb, Kansas, where people have this incredible response to just realizing they can't sleep. This is earlier in the book. It says, if something like this could happen to them, the Clutters, then who's safe, I ask you? One old man sitting here that Sunday, he put his finger right on it. The reason nobody can sleep, he said, all we've got out here are our friends. There isn't anything else. And so if they can't trust those friends in a small town, there's nothing else.
Yeah, and again, like, people didn't even have locks on their doors. They never thought to shut each other out. And then afterwards, I saw you have a note here that the hardware stores were sold out of locks in the area afterwards.
Yeah. People, it's not that they didn't lock their doors, they didn't even own locks.
Yeah, they didn't think to.
They didn't have locks on their doors. And I'll tell you, that was one detail from the documentary that made me pause and kind of have an emotion, like physically pause the documentary and have an emotional response, because I could not imagine living that way.
Me neither.
I could not imagine living in a house without multiple locks on every door and window.
Yeah.
I have bars on my windows on my lower floors as well. They're decorative and beautiful, but they're also there for security purposes.
Right. And to be fair, we live in the city, but even nowadays, I cannot imagine, you know, any friends that I know or family that like lives out in more like rural areas and stuff, they have locks on their doors. That was a time and a place where people were doing that, and that does not exist anymore.
And it starts to change, you and I have discovered, with the clutter murders.
Yeah.
That happens to coincide with this transition in American culture, in American life, in American people's perception of their own safety, of their own communities. It happens right here in the early 60s.
Right.
This is when America changes. And what is it like to live that freely?
Yeah, we'll never know.
We will never know what it's like to walk out of your house or to be in your house and have no fear, to approach strangers and have no fear of talking to them. This also would coincide with the hitchhiking era, right? There's lots of hitchhiking in Cold Blood too, which was very common in mid-20th century America.
And now there you constantly hear horror stories, or you hear people, warning you off, things like that, because nobody trusts one another anymore.
No.
I'm afraid to walk down as like a petite woman. I am constantly afraid walking streets alone at night. I am afraid, when men try to interact with me on the street, because I don't know what their intentions are. And I wish that we lived in a world where I could say hello to everyone that I pass and not be afraid that something bad is going to come out of that interaction, like that I'm going to get followed or something.
Yeah, and to be clear, Indigo and I do live in a city, right?
Right.
We are city dwellers, so we're not, this isn't just speculative.
Right.
I unfortunately happen to live in quite a dangerous neighborhood in the city. In the decades or so that I've lived there, there have been 5 murders right on my block, in view of my windows. So these are not speculative fears or fears fueled by media or whatever. But
or lived experiences.
They're more lived experiences, correct.
Yeah.
But I have some statistics here from Gallup, actually. These are from October of 2023 about Americans and our fear of crime and what it prevents us from doing. I tallied up some of the statistics here and saw that they're talking about things like driving through certain areas of your town, visiting areas of the cities near you, going to crowded events, talking to strangers, taking walks, etc. Very normal things. Americans polled in October of 2023, 57% of men said that at least some of these things they were prevented from doing because of fear of crime. 74% of women. 74% of American women said they were prevented from doing very ordinary things due to fear of crime.
Yeah.
And the standout, of course, was taking walks, jogging, or running alone in your area. 45% of American women said that fear of crime prevents them from doing that.
Yeah. And it's really sad. I love going for walks, but I would never go for a walk at night without
heavens, no.
Some kind of safety protection object on me or something, like mace or something. It's the whole thing where women are taught how to hold your keys between your fingers to protect yourself if you're walking home alone at night. And there have been times in the city that I have had to walk home alone at night and have almost been taken.
Sure.
That's the kind of world that we unfortunately live in.
Yeah, I know. We all have our horror stories.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I found another article by Melissa Erickson. This was from 2017. It was in the State Journal Register, which is a newspaper out of Springfield, Illinois. And the title of the article was From Hope to Fear. The 1960s started comfortably. Then we realized no one was safe. And so I'm just going to quote a little bit of this article where she says the 1950s are often seen as a golden age with stable families, a plentiful economy, and low crime rates. And so this was the world of the Clutters, right? Holcomb, Kansas. And this is very much the world that Twin Peaks evokes as well.
Yeah. It feels safe there. Even though
yeah.
we know what's happened to Laura, when we first see Twin Peaks, it feels so safe and warm and inviting.
Mm-hmm. And the crime is the aberration.
Yes.
Right.
People are shocked.
Not the norm.
No.
Not the norm. Again, continuing with Erickson's article, she says the mid-1960s ushered in a wave of violence, crime, and urban riots. America didn't only feel more dangerous, it was more dangerous. The violent crime rate increased by 126% between 1960 and 1970. An American's chances of being murdered was relatively low in the 50s and early 60s, but doubled between 1964 and 1974.
Which is crazy.
Yeah, so these weren't just perceptions, right?
Yeah.
These weren't just Americans freaking out about nothing. It really happened, and it hasn't stopped.
Yeah, it really has not. There's just, it's heartbreaking to a point where it is hard to process the atrocities that are happening in the world all the time. Like, just when you think you're like, okay, maybe I can like try to process this thing that I just saw in the news, then it's like, nope, there's another shooting, there's another mass shooting, there's another XYZ before you can even process the first one.
Actually, just today, I found information from the Office of the U.S. Surgeon General about gun violence in the United States. And it says 79% of U.S. adults report experiencing stress from the possibilities of a mass shooting. 79%. Absolutely staggering numbers.
I mean, yeah, the amount of shootings that have happened just in this year, as far as we've gotten in this year alone, it's terrifying. And you don't really see those kind of numbers. And for our listeners that are in other countries, I feel like I've seen a number of posts online where people are like, we just don't understand what's happening over in America. How does this happen so often?
2 nights ago, half a block from me in our playground, 13 shots fired at midnight, shell casings all over, 4 victims, no deaths. So
Thank God.
Yeah, but it's so routine, right? I didn't even wake up.
Yeah.
I found out about it the next morning.
So it's getting a little dark, not just outside, but in this podcast. But it's because we're living in this aftermath. We're living
Absolutely.
in the post in cold blood world, in this world where it has gotten more and more violent. It's gotten to the point where it's almost like desensitizing. It's everywhere.
And it's interesting that one of the most striking things to us about In Cold Blood is what is it like to live in this town before the murders? That freedom, that peace, that sense of trusting your neighbors and feeling at one with them is so inconceivable that it's as every bit as stunning as the story of the true crime itself. You see the impact on the people of the town right away. Again, quoting the book, they talk about the Clutter family. Feeling wouldn't have run half so high if this had happened to anyone except the Clutters, anyone less admired. Prosperous, secure, but that family represented everything people hereabouts really value and respect. And that such a thing could happen to them, well, it's like being told there is no God. It makes life seem pointless. I don't think people are so much frightened as they are deeply depressed. And that,
Which is so heartbreaking.
oh my gosh, it's like a paradigm shattering experience.
To say that feels like, to have this happen makes it feel like there's no God. And again, like, this was like a pretty religious community. Not like a cult or anything, but just like they were, farmers. A lot of them were some form of Christian. They took their faith seriously. So for it to get to the point where it has them questioning their faith, but it's understandable after seeing and experiencing something like that to people that you know and love deeply. That is something that would shake your world.
And what parallels do we see there with the town of Twin Peaks and the impact of Laura's murder?
Yeah, I mean, again, like that, even just that first scene where we see all of her classmates. And then when we see throughout, as the show goes along, when we start to meet more individual characters in the town of Twin Peaks, and we start to see, you know, more of what life is like there, we see the ways that this has really, I mean, even just like Laura not being around means like who's doing Meals on Wheels? Who's caring for these people? That's affecting those people. That's affecting Harold. That's like, in hindsight, we know a lot of things about Leland, but at the time, before you know what's happening, we see the way that it's affecting him and Sarah, how tragic it is.
Yeah.
We have Harriet writing her poem about Laura. We have Donna becomes this bizarre vigilante kind of, where she's like, I'm going to figure it out myself. James is devastated. Bobby, even though that things were in this sort of weird rocky flux state, he's still devastated. This town loved her. There's at least a point with almost every character throughout the entire show where we see them kind of break down or cry about Laura at some point.
Yeah.
Even the ones that we hate, even the ones that are bad people, even they will break down when it comes to Laura.
You know, in Indigo, I was just thinking about how Twin Peaks: The Return, you know, the town of Twin Peaks has changed so much.
It's
And
so much darker in The Return.
so much darker.
That's
And
the
so,
aftermath.
Our discussion, you know, this is not something we discussed before.
No, I'm like, my eyes are so big right now. I'm like processing this information live right now.
Our discussion of what it's like now to sit here, right, in an American city, and the way we kind of respond, that's very much the Twin Peaks of The Return.
Right.
The aftermath. And so it's interesting how...
Like the drug problems have gotten worse. The violence has gotten worse.
Yeah.
You can't even necessarily trust everyone in the sheriff's department.
Yeah, the darkness coming in.
Yeah.
The Richard Horns are on the loose.
They are.
Mr. C is in the world.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, is it's like, that's the catalyst event for them. Oof. I've got chills.
But to turn it a little positive, there is something about the town of Holcomb, Kansas, and the neighboring city, Garden City, where the trial is held, that there is still so much kindness and decency in these people that I think also deeply resonates in Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
So in spite of being faced with these horrible murderers, the town is so kind. Yeah. I'm really moved by the description of the sheriff's wife. So in Garden City, they have a jail, but it's in the sheriff's residence, right? And so they want to separate the prisoners. They separate Dick Hickok and Perry Smith. And Perry Smith is kept in the women's cell, which is literally in the kitchen of the sheriff's wife. And so she is very kind to both prisoners, but because she's right there with Perry Smith all the time, she's talking to him about what kind of food he might like. She's trying to cook for him. She's baking him pies. I love this idea that good food could possibly redeem him or help him. I mean, isn't that so much?
Well, I mean, also in comparison, we talked about this briefly, that one of the things that always stuck with me about Perry is it talks repeatedly about, like, he has like chronic pain from injuries and stuff, but he loves to chew on aspirin. So when you think about like him filling himself with that bitterness all the time, and then she's like, can I cook you a good meal?
and cooking him pies and somehow these small acts of nourishing and kindness and sweet and literal sweetness as a flavor is going to bring out some humanity, and these gestures of humanity on the part of the sheriff's wife are not ridiculed at all in the text.
No,
she's
it's
not
admired.
portrayed as a simpleton. It's quite admired, and I know that the whole cherry pie and coffee and donuts side of Twin Peaks is often smiled at derisively by the fans. That's all part of the picture, right? That's all part of the warmth and charm as well. And I like that that's reflected in Cold Blood. Right. Similarly, we see that the diner in the town, when Dick Hickok's parents are in town for the trial, they go to the diner where they are treated so kindly by everyone there. They're given ice cream on their pie for free. The town very quietly embraces them and kind of lets them know that they are not at fault.
Right.
For their son's
especially,
crimes.
As we said, they're really good people. And like,
Or just ordinary people.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just like they're trying to give them that benefit of the doubt of like, y'all don't seem like murderers. Like maybe,
Right.
or even like, I mean, like Perry, he is, and she's still so kind to him. But it's like, well, maybe the best thing you can do to fight evil is kindness, just show kindness.
Absolutely. Although people are depressed, although people are questioning their faith in God and all of that, they are pushing back against the evil with these small acts of kindness,
Right.
generosity, sweetness. It's like the spirit of the town does not want to die, does not want to give up.
Right.
And I think we
like
see
Twin
that in the
Peaks.
original series of Twin Peaks too.
Yeah.
Maybe even in season 3, right?
Yeah, I would say a little bit, but yeah, definitely like in the first two, in the original run, like when I think about that, like kind of kindness, of course I think of the double R.
Oh, yeah.
But I also think of like Lucy, you know, like just the way that she greets everyone who's coming in, and she's always got, you know, that sweetness to her. When we think about how friendly everyone is in the town of Twin Peaks, I mean, people welcome Coop, you know,
Oh,
into
yeah.
the town. You know, he becomes fast friends with everyone.
It's no
they're-
Deer Meadow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when you think about season 3, you know, even the double R is then violated by gunshots,
Yeah.
right? The shots fired through the window
Right.
of the double R. So we see that violence encroaching
Right.
on that very safe, warm, nurturing space.
Yeah, because we
there.
get so many important scenes in the first 2 seasons in the double R. All these scenes of like bonding and kindness and acts of love. You know, we have the scene with Bobby and his father. We have Coop meeting Annie and like, you know, getting to know her.
We have Gordon Cole and Shelley.
My dream.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, from everything that I understand, that was everyone on set's dream, and everyone was pretty jealous.
But in season 3, that's we're left with Ed and Norma. So I do
Yeah.
like that there's a lot of hope, right? The
Yeah.
redemption of the double R, love wins. And speaking of love winning, the end of the documentary Cold Blooded shows Bobby Rupp, Nancy Clutter's boyfriend, now of course quite old.
Yeah.
And he is responsible for petitioning the town of Holcomb, Kansas to erect a monument, a memorial to the Clutter family. And he himself is personally responsible for maintaining that memorial. And some of the closing images of the documentary are him going out and tending to this memorial, right? Sweeping up, polishing it. And they've assured him that after his passing, someone else will take over and do this. It made me tear up, and I know you too when I was
Yeah.
telling you about it.
I mean, because it, like, that's a perfect example of like, this is an act of love. This is an act of kindness that is actively fighting against the darkness. It is not letting their memory be forgotten, but it's also not doing it in such a way that, like with In Cold Blood, where it's kind of like a little sensationalized. You know, he is like, let me make something that we can remember them by, that is just a monument to them, that it's just something so that we don't forget them. They were loved by us. They were important to us. You know, it's not like we need to talk about the gruesome details. Let's just have something in this town to let their spirits know that they haven't been forgotten. Actively fighting that encroaching darkness with acts of love.
It's beautiful. And so much of season 3 also with Dougie Jones, right? And Dougie's beautiful influence on the people around him, the world around him, feels very much in that spirit.
It's so sweet. We love Dougie.
This just pure goodness and kindness, reshaping lives and pushing back against the darkness created by his doppelganger.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Mark Frost and David Lynch both coming of age during this era, right? Being born into an America that is quite safe and...
Right, because in Room to Dream,
Oh, yeah.
we hear so much about his childhood being so beautiful, so
And we will talk
safe.
a lot about that in our next episode.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And yeah, it was just reading that. I was like, what a different world that was, where you could be out all night playing with your friends. You weren't scared of anything happening to you.
Yes, absolutely. And by the time both of our authors, right, both Frost and Lynch are young men, America is changing, right? America is in this transitional place where people are feeling less safe, less trusting of their neighbors, and where the real dangers, actually are increasing.
Yeah, it's a very different world at that point.
And so we see Twin Peaks reflecting this kind of shared experience that's encapsulated in Cold Blood. So regardless of whether or not they're actually inspired by the text, this is a picture of America that's clearly reflected in Twin Peaks, right? Very much so.
So obviously this episode and then our past two have been a bit on the darker side.
A bit.
Yeah, it's gotten pretty grim at times. But as we just talked about, we are going to combat that darkness with the light, which is something that David Lynch does so often in his work. He always reminds us that there is also goodness. And so our next episode, actually our next couple episodes, are going to be a lot lighter, and the texts that we're going to be working with are going to be a lot lighter. So the next episode that we're going to do is
Good Times on Our Street. And so this is a 1940s children's reader that David Lynch has referred to numerous times as a core memory from his childhood. Indigo and I both have very, very old copies of it. Well, no new copies exist. Yeah. So we've scored some antiquarian books here, and we are so looking forward to talking about that. So that will be a much lighter episode. After that, we intend to talk about
Alice in Wonderland.
Yes, so Indigo and I happen to both be enormous lifelong fans.
Big time.
Of Alice in Wonderland. So that was an easy one for us just because of our personal connections to the text. This will be an Uncanny Resonance episode, but the connections are so much fun to have a look at and discuss.
So if you aren't already following us on social media, we are on Instagram.
And please, if you'd like to reach out, you can DM us on Instagram or email us at fullblossomoftheeveningpodcast@gmail.com. I want to close this episode, before our sign-off, with a poem. It's been kind of rattling around in my head these past 3 episodes we've recorded.
Yeah.
I feel as though we could dedicate it, right, to Nancy Clutter, to fictional characters like Laura Palmer.
Yeah.
And I want to present it without comment so that you, listener, can kind of let it rattle around in your brain too. It's by Audre Lorde. It's called There Are No Honest Poems About Dead Women. What do we want from each other after we have told our stories? Do we want to be healed? Do we want mossy quiet stealing over our scars? Do we want the powerful, unfrightening sister who will make the pain go away? Mother's voice in the hallway. You've done it right the first time, darling. You will never need to do it again. Thunder grumbles on the horizon. I buy time with another story. A pale blister of air, cadences of dead flesh obscure the vowels. Thank you for listening to The Full Blossom of the Evening. We'll close with, it was Laura.
And she's come to kiss you goodbye.
Thank you, listeners. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Gary, I have no idea where this will lead us, but I have a definite feeling it will be a place both wonderful and strange.
It was Laura, and I saw her glowing. I saw her smile.